I'm the Vice President for Teaching, Learning, and Evidence-Based Practices at the Gardner Institute, and I'm joined today by my wonderful colleague and friend, Dr. Brandon Smith. Brandon, would you like to introduce yourself?
I sure would, Steph. Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for choosing to join us today for this info session on curricular analytics. We really hope that this is more of a discussion. We'll share some stuff on the front end, but we hope you'll stick around at the end and ask questions because there's only so much you can cover in just a few minutes. But I am a senior associate vice president at the Gardner Institute. I get to collaborate with Steph and Dr. Rob Rodier on curricular analytics work, which we think is pretty fun. Even in our spare time, we get together and talk about kind of cool things related to curricular analytics. And we're doing some new things. So if you know a little bit about curricular analytics from the literature, you're going to find out we're doing some kind of innovative things related to it that will be available to people who choose to join us for the curricular analytics community. So thanks again for being with us. I'll pass the mic back to Steph and we'll jump right in.
Thank you, Brandon. And I'm going to let Katie introduce herself. We have another wonderful colleague who's here who will be sharing some information with you all. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Steph. Hi, my name's Katie Locke. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications here at the Gardner Institute, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions on how to get involved, how to get registered, all those kinds of details, and I'll be sharing some information with you later on. Thanks, Steph.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you, Katie. And Katie put a reminder in the chat, if you will please introduce yourselves with name, role, and why you're here today. You should have also the ability to unmute. We don't need to do verbal introductions now, but to Brandon's point, we would welcome your questions and comments at any point. We'll have time at the end of the presentation, but if there are things that are important to you that you would like to ask about before then, please feel free to put those in the chat or raise a hand, and we'll be happy to recognize you. And thank you to Erin for kicking us off with the introduction. So we're going to be talking about our curricular analytics community, but first I want to give a quick introduction to the Gardner Institute because some of you may or may not be familiar with our work. Our organization is more than 25 years old now. We'll have an anniversary this fall. And we are a nonprofit organization that is focused on helping institutions to improve student success outcomes. So to ensure that more students have the opportunity to graduate with whatever credential they wish to graduate with. We work with 2-year and 4-year institutions, large, small, private, public, all different types of institutions. And this work that we're going to talk about today, curricular analytics, is, we think, foundational to student success, creating clear pathways for students to be able to progress through academic majors, including the general education or whatever version of gen ed you have at your institution. So this is very aligned with our mission, and we think that it's something that is critical when we consider student success, especially as we reframe our thinking about student success. So along those lines, a little bit of the background about this opportunity. We're going to talk specifically about the components of the curricular analytics community. We're going to show you some of the visualizations and talk through what you would be doing if you chose to be a part of the community. But we think at the heart of this is a real opportunity. And the opportunity first sort of bubbled up many years ago. I don't even remember what year it was. Well before my time at the Gardner Institute, and I've been here for 8 years. The conversations began about curricular pathways and curricular complexity. But in 2021, we began really tackling this problem specifically through the development of what we have now, the curricular analytics community. We've had this version for a few years. So in this article that's linked in the presentation slides, the title of it appeared in the Chronicle in 2021. It says, "Is your degree program too complicated?" And the answer to the question is yes. For most of us, degree programs are indeed too complicated, including, I think I'm not speaking out of turn, the programs that Brandon and I both created and directed at our previous institutions, we found through this work were indeed too complicated. There were too many blockers, in terms of student progression and success. So this article highlights some of the early work and also articulates, I think, very well the opportunity that we have here to re-envision the curricula, to create clear pathways for students to progress through. So I want to highlight a little bit about the community practice, rather, the curricular analytics community. And I want to share with you sort of what to expect. So we have this focus on curricular pathways. So thinking about curricular visualizations, creating curricular pathways, so reducing some of the complexity that exists. But to do that, we create visualizations. So one of the first things that you do is to begin to visualize your curricula. So you upload programs of study, and there are inquiry guides that we've created. And through a process, you look at the opportunities for re-envisioning your curricula. And this is the initial period sort of engagement. And during that time, we have meetings every week. And during those synchronous sessions, you learn about some of the improvement science methodology that we use, and we apply that to the curricular visualizations and to thinking through what we can do differently and what sort of outcome we might want to accomplish in terms of our creating clear curricular pathways. And then we meet as a community of practice or a networked improvement community throughout the academic year. So we have ongoing support while you're in the initial phase, but also throughout the process, because the idea is that we would take smaller groups of faculty and staff and provide some training and support, and then you would bring that to your institutions and engage them, faculty and staff at your institution, in a broader sort of scale in conversations about the things that you've learned. So looking at some of these potential areas where you might focus and thinking through what you might do differently. So we offer support initially and also through this ongoing process that you would engage in. And then periodically we come together to share what we've learned in an effort to learn from and with each other. And then we also have a platform that supports our work. We use a learning management system and a platform. The platform helps us create visualizations, and you have access to the platform and the learning management system throughout the duration of your work with us. So it gives you an opportunity to add more users so you can increase the potential capacity for this work at your institution. So initially, we often start with the smaller teams, and then you bring in additional folks to help them to begin to tackle some of the problems of practice and create more opportunities for smoother curricular pathways and less complexity. And just a little bit more specifically about some of the topics that help us to do this. So as I mentioned, we begin with the visualizations. There's a wonderful little infographic to the right-hand side that our colleague Brittany Connor, who's here moderating, created for us a couple of years ago. We begin with the visualizations, so we move into analysis. So we analyze what we're seeing using methodology from improvement science. We begin to devise a plan. And then during the community of practice, you implement the plan, you study the outcomes, and then we learn from and with each other. This is not sort of a one and done exercise. We believe in continuous improvement. That's really at the heart of improvement science. And so we start off with some early introduction and basic logistics to help people be able to upload and create their visualizations. That's the first step in the process. We have primer sessions set up, and then we also do an initial session in the curricular analytics community where we basically just create our visualizations. And we look at the different factors that comprise these visualizations. So we're looking at delay factor and blocking factor, et cetera. And we have a new factor that we also are considering, the gateway course factor, and Brandon will talk more about that in just a little bit. We go through a process of identifying problems. So we do some mapping and understanding the system as it exists, and visualizing the system is also important in that process. And then we think about what improvement would look like and identify some of the drivers for improvement. We create a plan, do, study, act cycle. So this helps us to think about how we can move forward, who should be involved, how they should be involved, and what timeline we might commit to, and what are some of the benchmarks. So some of the ways that we might assess our success as we begin to implement. And then at the very end, we have a presentation. So you have an opportunity to present your initial plan and then move into that implementation phase of the work. So during the initial period, we would focus on all of this, and then we would move into implementation, and that's when you would be a part of the regular community practice or networked improvement community meetings. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brandon, who is going to talk more specifically about the visualizations and how we generate those, the ways in which we use them, and why they're important in this work. Brandon?
Thanks, Steph. I want to pause for just a second and acknowledge all the great sort of comments and notes in the chat, and just tell folks, if you're just joining us, please do tell us your name, your role, and kind of why you're here if you haven't done so already. But it looks like we're already seeing some trends related to folks wanting to focus on retention or do some structural analysis of programs of study, which means you're in the right place. When we think about this, slide shows a static picture of one of these curriculum graphs that we use within our platform, and this is just a static image, but on the platform, I'll jump in there in just a moment. There's really a dynamic workspace where you can do some testing. But when we started this work, we realized that there's not really a great way to visualize the connections, prerequisite and co-requisite connections across courses within most majors. So because of that, we don't understand the dependencies between those courses. And for a lot of folks, a list within a course catalog doesn't show us the real impact. Being able to visualize those connections changes our way of saying, wow, is this intentional? Do we need to make changes? This is why term 2 is so challenging for our students, those kinds of things. So this tool really empowers stakeholders at your institution to analyze your curriculum in ways that, at least before this, I've never seen anything quite like it. When Greg Heileman and Shawi Abdullah, two of our fellows, first shared this with us, it was really eye-opening. Next slide, please. So Steph talked about the approach. We're really interested in looking at curricular complexity. Is not good or bad. It is a quantifiable number, and it associates with the outputs. You see the output cause piece right there? It correlates with outputs in your programs related to things like retention, graduation rates, time to graduation, and students graduating with excess credit accumulation. If any or all 4 of those are present within a program of study, it is likely ripe for curricular analytics. And to that end, there are lots of reasons why those numbers exist. The curricular analytics is a sort of way into analyzing all those different causes using quantitative and qualitative measures with your faculty and staff. So we really want you to embrace that complexity. And in our experience, the improvement science takes us step by step, pretty rapidly through a process of analyzing the causes and then coming up with some potential ideas for testing. And it's really powerful. So I'm going to jump into the platform, but before I do, I just want to share these are the 4 quantitative metrics associated with curricular analytics. Blocking factor, how many courses does this class block with prereq relationships? Delay factor, on the longest chain associated with this course, how many terms exist? Centrality, this is roads in, roads out. It's essentially how many courses on the front or back end is this course connected to. It matters related to momentum and student success. When students pass highly central courses, they tend to have access to lots of additional coursework. And then the overall complexity is the sum of the blocking and delay factor. And it just gives us an idea of this course, has a higher complexity rating overall. So I'll show you what this means by jumping into the platform now. Any questions before we go? Because I know we have to cover so much in such a short period of time. When you actually get engaged in the community, we slow way down. So I've got an example accounting course open here. And this is the actual tool. So this is built with publicly available data, typically pulled right out of your course catalog. You can build it by hand using a CSV file, or we've actually started to automate this process. And typically there's a little bit of correction on the back end, but we've removed, I think, one of the main barriers to getting this done, which is building the maps. But if you wanted to build one by hand, it takes about an hour and a half usually. So number of credits in this program, the overall complexity, that number, again, neither good nor bad, but correlates to your measures of things like retention, grad rates. If you're able to, we like to say, address the complexity, because there's multiple ways to do that, either by lowering this number or by addressing systems like advising, student support, other factors, then you should see an increase in student success by those metrics. So every term has a complexity score, which is again the sum of the complexity within that term across the courses. And then when we click on a course, it'll freeze there and it'll show us that this has a complexity of 3, which is the sum of the blocking factor. This econ class blocks one class across 1-2 terms. So that's what we have here. You'll see right away this has a little higher factor, right? It's 15. Well, this blocks all these courses, and again, when we click on it, we can start to see what the next course in sequence is. We can start to try to understand how courses connect, from term 1 to term 2. And we have a inquiry guide that we offer to support faculty going through this that help them ask questions, basically use this as a point of inquiry and go back and say, okay, so where is your highest complexity? And they can do that by just looking at the nodes, or they can go to this piece and they can sort by centrality, right? So again, like this accounting class, if students pass 386 and 301 and maybe 497, they're probably really likely to finish this degree program. But so this is one use case. I'm actually going to show you 2 of the other use cases that we've developed in recent years. So this is a program of study. You can also look at a transfer map. So this takes credits earned at a 2-year institution, transferring into a 4-year, and so you can build maps for your 4-year and based on some of your 2-year transfer institutions, and see how students experience the curriculum differently. And I promise you they do. For example, this math class, variable calculus, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 terms, or there were. They've made some changes since we initially did this, before the students apply that math. This was a surprise to both the sending and receiving faculty. They didn't realize this. Neither did they realize that their articulation agreement was designed to have more terms than they meant. Another piece was this wall, this complexity wall. So this is a really interesting thing that you'll have full access to. You can build one of these out. And then the last one is our newest piece, and I think one that I would argue we're pretty excited about. So while these are looking at programs of study, we've also started looking at individual courses across multiple programs of study. And so this takes, for example, an algebra class and tells us that this algebra class blocks 93 other courses at the institution across 8 terms. And I can pick a major and click on the terminal node, and it'll show me all of the courses that get traced back to algebra in that major. Why is this useful? Because if we have a course that we know a lot of our students are taking, and a lot of our students may be having challenges with earning grades like D's, failures, withdrawals, and incompletes where they're not getting any credit, we can start to trace how those students should be scaffolding learning within majors. We can start to have conversations across majors. So this is a really cool additional use case. And again, we've even automated this. These maps used to be very difficult to build, and we're making that something that's very approachable. So this is the tool in a nutshell. The only thing I didn't show you all, which might be the coolest thing, and I should have, is that you can, in addition to the view and list, you can create copies of this and do what if scenarios. So I can go in and say, well, okay, we've got a lot of complexity in this second term. Looks like we've got a gap here. What happens if I just move this course over to distribute some of the complexity? Or what happens if I move this course over and give them a little bit more space in case they're not successful in this comms class? So you can do that. You can remove courses. You can add prereqs. And so your team can essentially treat this like a sandbox to see how moving things around impacts structural complexity really quickly. And save new copies and say, well, here's option 1, here's option 2, here's an option with this course rotation. So it's pretty neat. Again, it tells you why I probably don't get invited to parties much, because I think this is super cool.
Well, not just you, Brandon, but me too.
I know.
I was gonna say, I think we all do on this side.
Yeah. So,
So we have, Brandon has shared with you some of the use cases for, well, the different visualizations in the curricular analytics community. So we look at We can look at retention in individual programs. We can look at, across programs. You can look at the time to degree completion, transfer. So we're looking at programs of study. So you can look at individual majors, you can look at individual courses with our Gateway Course Factor, and you can also look at transfer. So I think it's important to share all of those. And where we start is with the programs of study. So we're starting off with that and looking specifically at what's happening in the programs of study. And then there are other data that we can layer in. There's an annotation column in the CSV file where you can add in DFWI rates or course rotation information. All of this is important to have a more complete picture of what the student experience really is, because we're taking sort of this idea of an advising checklist and visualizing it to really understand better what the actual student experience is. And all of those other data, qualitative and quantitative, can help inform that understanding. So I wanted to put that out there as well. Brandon, I think that we have you down to talk about this, but I'm happy to share these institutional examples. You're ready to go. There you go.
Sure, happy to. So these are just some examples of how this tool has been brought to bear. And honestly, we've got other examples and some case studies that we'd be happy to share with you. But if you look at the literature, a lot of times what's out there is related to STEM areas. And we want to drive home that this is great for STEM. It's great for any program. And even a program that you might think doesn't have a lot of prereq complexity, we've seen this applied to great benefit because the faculty are able to make some visualizations. So the 2D, 3D example, what they found was there were legacy prereqs that had been on the books for a long time that maybe they didn't need anymore, which was creating unnecessary complexity. And so they redesigned a couple of programs of study very quickly, pushed it through the state level board, and got this done very quickly with updated courses that were less complex, had less redundancy in upper level courses, and they were really excited. Engineering, the program in question here, had pretty low completion and persistence across the board, but especially for some of their historically resilient communities. They just didn't feel like they were supporting their students as well as they'd like. And so they changed some advising tools, which very frequently happens in this work as we suddenly realize there's an opportunity there to communicate a little differently. But they also offered some new readiness and support for students. So they had some new ways of measuring student readiness for certain courses and then more support options. And then finally, they realized that in the same term they were having, and again, you would think maybe we'd notice this, but this process brought forth that frequently students were being invited to travel from one campus to another for courses in the same day, in the same term, and that was causing challenges. So those were some examples of how they drove change. The biology example, they started with one program, and what they very quickly realized was that the extended time to completion was a problem in all the different bio majors they offered, and that they actually had a difference between what the faculty advisors and the professional advisors were sharing with students. And so they fixed that. They fixed some course sequencing, and then they changed some of their support and removed some unnecessary prereqs and saw great benefit. And then finally, some institutions we've worked with are using this to do campus-wide reformation and redesign where they're combining majors that maybe have lower enrollments, or where they are testing out some ideas for new majors, and even some that have made this part of it, every 5 years, that this is something that every program does as part of their process of review, is going through this process because it allows them to analyze where they're having success, where they want to drive change. So those are just a couple of use cases that we've seen from our institutions.
Thank you, Brandon. And I put in the chat a link to the webpage about the curricular analytics community. At the bottom of it are some new case studies that we have that highlight some additional institutional examples of how this tool, this process, have been used at various types of institutions. One of them speaks specifically to campus-wide. So if you're interested in learning more about that, because that's a huge category, but there's a wonderful example from Eastern Washington about the ways in which they have used this tool and process to help make some decisions about what courses to offer, and even some programs, so making some programmatic changes in terms of academic majors. Lindsay put a question in the chat. How long would it take to implement something like this? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Lindsay, because the first example on the screen, those changes with 2D, 3D art, came from a very early example in one of our early offerings of the curricular analytics community. And Brandon and I were astonished at how quickly these changes were made. In the time, it was less than 9 weeks that we were going through the initial part of the engagement, probably more like 6 weeks. The faculty member who was joining us, there were a few faculty members, but the person who was the chair of the department pushed through the changes in their department curricular committee and then at the institutional level, the university level committees, and had made the changes to remove those legacy prerequisites and to create new courses in that short span of time. It was astonishing how quickly that person was able to move. So in some cases, people can make changes immediately, removing legacy prerequisites, co-requisites, so examining those relationships and cleaning some of that up. Also, working on course rotation and waivers, those are all things too that come to light sometimes in this process. So those are things that can often be tackled very quickly. Some of the other changes that take more time, may require adding new courses or proposing a new course or redesigning, in terms of student learning outcomes. And you have to go through obviously the different layers of governance that you have at your institution. So that may take more or less time. It depends on probably the timing and the type of institution and governance structure you have. But for the most part, people have been able to implement changes within the year. So within the year that they're involved and engaged with us, they have a plan, they begin to implement it, within that year in some form or fashion. You're very welcome. So on the next slide, this just reiterates those use cases that we've already articulated. So the completion of individual programs of study, which we visualize first. Looking at transfer student success, Brandon showed you an example from some of the work that we did with CSUSB and JP College, and those are a real rich opportunity if you're interested at looking, whether you're a sending or receiving institution, looking at, what's happening to your students, either if you're sending them somewhere else or if you're receiving institutions, understanding better that transfer student picture. And Brandon, Rob, and I just published a chapter in a book about the early work that we've done related to transfer students and mapping their curricula from the sending and receiving institutions. And then to visualize the gateway course connections, which Brandon and I really geek out on because it helps us to better understand the primacy of these courses. Brandon showed you a very complex gateway course map, but really digging into the relationships, the pre and co-requisite relationships associated with these courses can help us to understand better the significance that they have and those that need to be involved in the work that we're doing. So it's not just about teaching the course, but understanding how we scaffold the learning and how the learning outcomes are addressed both within the course and beyond. So these are all very important issues to tackle, I think, in terms of curricular complexity. And Brandon, I think this one is yours, or would you like me to speak to it?
I'm okay. This is great. So as we think about who we might involve, it's usually very beneficial to involve faculty. But we've also seen institutions that were really successful pulling together an initial team where we've got academic affairs, admissions, research staff, student affairs, really anybody who's involved in the programs or courses that you're interested in. It's great to have a diverse group of stakeholders, and some institutions even run this crazy thing, run it by students, right? To see how they've experienced these courses. So we would recommend that you pull together a kind of a small team to learn the process and then teach others. But we've done some adaptive work, and we highly recommend that as you pull together a team, if you decide to do this work, that you also set aside a little time to do the work between meetings. And the institutions that do that, again, as far as how quickly they're able to move pretty rapidly. With 1 to 2 hours a week of time set aside for those 6 to 8 weeks, it's amazing how quickly they identify problems they want to solve and really start to drive change. So, and this is Katie.
Yep.
Thank you, Brandon. So how do you join the curricular analytics community? And the all-important question, what are the fees involved? So there is an application process to complete. It's about 4 questions. We will send you the link to that in our follow-up email. The questions aren't to evaluate you. It's really just to check and make sure that what you're hoping to get from the curricular analytics community aligns with what you will receive. So just to make sure it's a good fit. The fees are based on your undergraduate enrollment. They're listed here. The bands are, we use College Navigator to determine which band you're in. And those fees can be split into 2 fiscal years if that's beneficial to you. And we have the list here of the different dates that the meetings will be held and times. And I do want to say, in case it wasn't mentioned, that these will all be available asynchronously after they occur synchronously. And if you want to go on to the next slide.
There's a question, Katie, really quickly
Oh,
related
sorry.
to what's on the screen, the degree seeking only or undergraduate headcount for the College Navigator. I know the answer, but I'll let you answer.
I'll let you answer.
Oh, I think it's based on your undergraduate enrollment. So not just
Right.
degree seeking, but enrollment.
Okay, thank you. That's what I thought. It's
You're
like,
welcome.
yeah, whatever number it says in College Navigator is just the number we use. And if there's a reason for us not to use that number, we don't ever want price to be the reason somebody doesn't participate. So if, we'll do what we can to help make it more easier for you all to join. So I always like to mention that we have a lot of processes and academies. And in fact, all of them are not listed on this slide right here. And I am not going to list them all for you. But just to say, if you signed up for this and you're like, oh, this is not at all what I thought it was going to be, or I'm really interested in something else, we are happy to, I'm happy to just have a chat with you and make sure that you're learning about what is going to be the best opportunity for student success at your institution. And you can always just reach out to info@gardnerinstitute.org. Those emails come to me, and then I sort of disseminate them to the people who are best able to answer your questions. And we have coming up in the next 6 months, 3 in-person events. We have our symposium, which is our annual conference. And what makes it unique is that it is half workshop, half conference. So there is one of the tracks, Brandon will be working in that track on curricular analytics. So it's a great way to come and sort of play around with the tool and learn a little bit more about curricular analytics. So that is in Chicago on October 31st to November 2nd. Just preceding that is the Graduate Student Experience, which is our conference focusing on student success in graduate education. And our third thing is if you're interested in transfer, not transformation, transfer. We are having a 2-day workshop based on one of the books that John Gardner and Drew Koch edited on transfer. So it's called Transforming the Transfer Experience Workshop. And that's in January, located here in Asheville, North Carolina. So we would love to have you join us for any or all of those events.
And I will mention, Katie, before we move from this slide, that there is a track at the symposium on curricular analytics, as you've shared, and I think you shared. And then the transfer experience workshop will also be talking about transfer students and curricular complexity as well. There are actually quite a few topics in that workshop that will relate specifically to this work, but Brandon, Rob, and I will be presenting there too.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, there is a question in the chat from Lindsay. Thank you for the question. If we are unable to do it at this time, will there be another opportunity in the future? And yes, there is. We generally offer this curricular analytics community twice a year, although that could change. So don't bank on that, but we do have spring dates identified. So if there's enough interest, we'll be offering it at the spring as well, but at least once a year and possibly twice a year.
And one thing that I'm not sure we said, but is worth noting is that if you are involved in our transformation process, there's no additional cost to do curricular analytics. So we offer transformation as another one of our potential engagements, which is really the umbrella under which it's the all you can eat buffet of the Gardner Institute, and it's a multi-year process. But if you're in that, if you happen to be someone on the call, because we frequently have folks that are in the midst of the transformation work, trying to learn more about some of the engagements. So if that's you, know that there's no additional cost, that you're already covered.
Excellent point. And if that is you, then reach out to your project leader and they'll get you involved.
Other questions or comments? And you can feel free to raise a virtual hand or a physical hand if you'd like to, or put them in the chat.
It's awfully quiet. We will stick around if you'd like. If you'd like to stick around, we can always unmute folks and would be happy to have a conversation. But we just thank you for spending 38 minutes with us this afternoon. And we'll hopefully see you in future meetings and maybe either at the symposium or in curricular analytics. So thanks again, and be well.
Thank you,
Oh, here we
everyone.
go. We've got Aaron is saying, used the CA tool a few times. Can you share more about the automation function? Yes, it's only available in the community, Aaron. It's something we've developed in-house, the automation function. It's something we've been testing, and that is fairly new for us, but it's working pretty reliably right now. So it's available through the community.
There's a question from Sujoy. Does the tool provide any recommended paths that have been found to be successful at similar institutions? No, the visualization tool that we looked at just helps you visualize the curricula. So any recommendations would come from case studies that we have from our community of practice, so we can share examples of what other institutions have done and help you get connected, because we've been doing this for a couple of years. So there are folks that have done peer embedded support, that have, redesigned curricula, that, have done all sorts of other things that we can help you get connected to. And then we do have those case study examples as well.
Does the tool provide any recommended path that has been found successful? Oh, that's the same one. It just says thanks. Great. Okay.
And I just wanted to add, the preferred deadline for registering for this is September 5th, which feels like it's a long way away, but but it's not. If you need a little bit of leeway, just reach out. We can give you that. So just let us know. We will be sending this recording. If you have questions and you need to, connect somebody else at your institution, again, reach out and we can make that happen.
All right, I think we'll stop the recording. We can hang out a few more minutes. And again, we're just so grateful for the time you've spent with us, and let us know if we can answer any questions now or later. Thanks, everyone.